All right, guys. Chapter 3. Um, this is a shorter chapter. This is kind of a brief history. If you've read the chapter, it's kind of a brief history of print media. Um, by the way, on that note of reading the chapter, and this is just a matter of preference. Some people prefer to listen to the lecture first and then read the chapter. I sort of advocate the opposite. I advocate reading the chapter first and then um, watching the lecture, but it's up to you. Um, so print media, the advent of print media was really important for many reasons. Most notably, print media allowed for mass literacy. It became much easier to teach people how to read when you had print media, especially a lot of printed material, right, to choose from. And when we got mass literacy, we ended up getting a lot of great advancements in knowledge, right? So print media are really, really important. Reading is really important to civilization. Sometimes that goes unnoticed, but if you look at even today, societies that have you can almost just look at the literacy rate in a society and you can figure out how advanced that society is going to be, right? So print media are tremendously important. One thing that has been argued by some scholars is that print media actually help promote certain kinds of thinking skills, like critical thinking skills. Marshall McLuhan was a scholar who believed in this idea that he called the medium is the message. And that with the medium as the message, what he was saying was that it's not the content that is important, or at least not as important. What's more important than the content is how the content is presented. In other words, through which medium content is presented. So, for instance, Marshall McLuhan says the print medium is important in its own right because it fosters certain ways of thinking. It allows us to ponder, think, reflect, and develop more sophisticated responses to messages. TV fosters another kind of thinking, according to McLuhan. So for McLuhan, the medium is actually more important than the content, which is why he says the medium is the message. What are the functions of print media? Well, transmission of culture, for one thing. We learn a lot about culture, and we learn a lot about our own culture through the printed word, right? If you think about religion, for instance, right, holy scriptures, you look at the Torah and the Bible and the Quran and other religious texts, holy scriptures. These have greatly influenced a great many civilization, right? If you look at Western civilization, there's no question, and certainly there is a trend toward increased secularization in Western societies. I don't think we can deny that, but I don't think there's any denying either that religion and specifically biblical tradition has influenced Western societies like the United States. And the same is true of many other societies, right, where religious texts have held great sway. If you look at the way in which ideas are spread, the way knowledge is spread, at the center of that is the printed word. Think about the phenomenon of the book, the printed book, and how much knowledge was advanced after the printed word. It was much more difficult to teach people and to spread and diffuse knowledge when we didn't before there was printed material. You could still do it, and there were still scholars, but it was much more difficult, right? But once we had books and textbooks, think about the importance of textbooks. I mean, you're taking this class right now, you have a textbook. It guides you, it guides me as the instructor of the class. So books in all these different areas, in the hard sciences, the social sciences, the arts, literature, history, and so on and so forth. Really, at the heart of this is print print media. Without the printed word, it would be much more difficult to spread this kind of knowledge. And then you look at newspapers and magazines; they teach us about current events. Obviously, the printed word also entertains us. If we were in class right now, I'd ask for a show of hands as to how many of you read novels on a regular basis. Some people are. I mean, there are people. I've had students who have read hundreds of novels. That's kind of their hobby, right? There are people who can just devour novels. They can read a novel in a day, right? You probably know some of these people. Maybe you are one of those people. There are other people who love comic books. There are other people like me. I'm not really into novels. I'm not really into comic books. Never have been. But I'm into nonfiction. I like to read history. I like to read, things that some people might consider boring. Sociology and political science and media studies. That's one of the reasons why I got into this field, because I like reading about it and learning about it. One of the things that's important to note is that Americans are reading less today than they used to, and that's not a good thing, in my estimation. However, e-books, some of you probably have e-readers, like you might have the Amazon Kindle, for instance. Those the electronic, what do you call them, these e-readers and e-books, they are making a positive change, and we've seen some evidence that reading among Americans is increasing really over the last 10 or 15 years, and that's a positive trend. Let's just go through a brief history of books here. All I've done, I'm going to go through this really quickly. All I've done here is reproduce some of what the textbook says. I'm just highlighting some of the kind of the major, points in the timeline. I'm certainly not going to ask you to go through and list all of these on an exam, but I think it would be useful to know some of these big points. I mean, for instance, that ancient Egyptians excuse me, wrote the Book of the Dead on papyrus, which is like a really thin paper, back in 1800, before the Common Era, right? Ancient Egyptians wrote the Book of the Dead. It was kind of a sort of like a manual of what happened, how to bury the dead, what happens after death in their belief system. Um, Codex was the precursor to the modern book. It was a manuscript of bound individual pages, and you find these also 100, the year 100 before the Common Era, which is sort of counterintuitive, because if you would have asked me, I would have thought that would have happened later. But it happens in 100 before the Common Era, Codex. If you look at pre-modern books, it's interesting because you didn't have a mechanical printing press, so they were written by hand. This is actually an ancient copy of the Quran, which is like this is like 1350 years old. It's on display at some museum, I think in Istanbul, and I can actually read some of this because I can read Arabic. So from right to left, in the top right corner there, it says Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, which means in the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful. Some of the rest of it I have some difficulty with because they don't have the diacritical marks. My wife could probably read all of this because she's fluent in reading Arabic. I'm not super fluent, but I'm okay. But this is it. It had to be. Think about how difficult it was to distribute books at this time, because you had to write. You had to have a professional writer write every single book by hand. That takes an enormous amount of time. Here's a copy of the Bible in Greek. I'm not sure if anyone here has taken Greek. I have not, so I cannot read this. But again, this is a handwritten, and this is also on display somewhere. I got this off of the internet, but took great care to write these pre-modern books. In the 13th century, we get a major kind of milestone: movable copper alloy type printing in Korea. So a lot of the times we have this Western bias where we think that it all started here in the 15th century with what we call the Gutenberg printing press. But, traditions and civilizations kind of build on one another. And this is kind of one of the steps is this movable alloy type in Korea. And in the 14th century, about 100 years after this was invented, a famous book was produced, Jikji, Selected Teachings of Buddhist Sages and Seon Masters. And this is the earliest known book that was printed, an entire book that was printed with this movable metal type. And it's on display in Paris. And this is actually what it looks like. Looks really cool. In the 15th century, we get the Gutenberg printing press in Germany, 1455 to be specific. The Gutenberg Bible was the first thing that was published. That was published in 1455, and that is considered the beginning of the mechanical printing era. And that's the Gutenberg printing press. Don't ask me how it would work. I think that thing in the middle there, that lever-looking thing, I think that's what you would. I think you pulled that down to initiate the printing process. Um, the paper would go somewhere in the middle, and then I think it would be kind of spit out that bottom sort of feeder looking thing. But obviously, super clunky. Be thankful next time we get frustrated with our HP printers or whatever we have, but because they give us we'll get these little mechanical errors or whatever every once in a while. But be thankful that you don't have to use one of these bad boys, because this looks like it would be quite arduous, to say the least. Um, the printing press helped spread scientific knowledge to a great extent, and it actually helped give rise to the European Renaissance. By the early 1800s, textbooks were playing a key role in public education, and it allowed a lot of people to become educated. Just think about, again, as I mentioned earlier, how much easier it is to organize a university education, or a high school education for that matter, any kind of education, with textbooks that guide the process. And ultimately, books and textbooks helped reduce illiteracy among the masses. Another key contributor was in American society was the dime novel. These were novels that sold for 10 cents a piece. The reason why these were so important is because they were so cheap. Even poor people could afford them. And so it allowed a lot of people to read, and it actually helped decrease the illiteracy rate in modern societies, like the United States. In 1939, here in the U.S., you have Pocket Books. They were the first mass market paperback book publisher, and they published their first book back in 1939. Again, that allowed for a great proliferation in paperback books. A lot of novels produced in the 1940s and 1950s, printed in paperback form and distributed widely. And again, they were pretty inexpensive, so a lot of people could read them. More recently, we get this print on demand phenomenon, POD. It allows publication of single books or small print jobs using laser printing and other methods. So you could actually, write a book, and it would be easy for you to publish at least a handful of copies using this print on demand technology. Digital books, which I've already kind of talked about a little bit, but these e-readers are so nice because, first of all, you can take them with you wherever you are. You can read them wherever you're on the plane, you're in the waiting room, and it acts just like a regular book with one important addition, and this is critical. You can save, as you guys probably know better than I know, because I don't even own one of these things, but you can save many books on this one digital device. So this is one of the current really positive trends that some experts think has contributed to an increase in reading. You can also search on these things. You can take notes on these devices. So they're really handy dandy. Looking at some of the current trends, sales numbers have fluctuated. Um, there have been increases and decreases over the last several years, but the recession of the last, since 2008 has hit book publishers, among other people, pretty hard. Industry mergers and consolidation have allowed publishers to increase profit margins by reducing operating costs associated with warehousing, marketing, and sales. It's really streamlined processes, but we also get some of what we've talked about, that concentration of ownership, where you have fewer and fewer people owning the book publishing houses. Books are part of that big media, that global media industry. You've probably noticed that a lot of books are turned into movies. If we were in class right now, I'd ask you for your favorite book turned movie. We always have a nice, interesting discussion and debate on that in class. But just think about how many movies you've seen that were first books. So there's kind of a really nice symbiotic relationship there between books and movies. And as I've mentioned, ebooks have kind of changed the game. We might ask ourselves, will we still have bookstores in 50 years? Will Barnes and Noble still exist? Will they be able to adapt to the times? Or will people just stop reading traditional books, hard copy, paperback or hard cover books? Um, Most recently, audiobooks have started to emerge as major players, and I've gotten into these, and I highly recommend them. You'd be amazed at how many titles they have available now. I buy CD books, and it's great. I live in Madison, so I drive about an hour a day to UNA. And so what I don't do this every day, but a lot of times I'll just grab one of these books and I'll just stick it in, and it's great. I mean, it's somebody's basically reading the book to you. So you can learn a lot. It's highly entertaining. The way they produce them, they have really outstanding readers. The books that I've read or listened to, I should say, have been really nicely done. So if you haven't listened to an audiobook, you might be surprised at how much you enjoy it. So check those out. Um, I think what I'm going to do now is, because I like to break these up, we're about halfway through this lesson. It's a shorter lesson, so I'm going to stop here and I'll pick it up in part two. I'm actually more than halfway, so that's good. So see you in part two of chapter 3.